Have you ever seen a trailer for a game and thought to yourself, man, they sure are trying to convey some political message here? I am, of course, talking about a recent game that has a lot of fans excited.
In 2077, they voted my city the worst place to live in America. Main issues: sky-high rate of violence, and more people living below the poverty line than anywhere else.
That's right, unlike the cowards at Naughty Dog's, CD Projekt Red had the balls to include politics in their trailer right off the bat. Of course, that's not what gamers are upset about. Sure, a dystopia suffering from the negative effects of unrestrained capitalism, such as a staggering class divide, are all well and good, but there are lesbians in The Last of Us too. Lesbians! Now, the existence of homosexuality in media wouldn't be of much concern to a functional human being. Hell, it might even be celebrated. But we aren't talking about your average Joe. We're dealing with gamers. Capital G bona fide gamers. It's a common sentiment among some temperamental individuals that gaming has become increasingly polarized by the dreaded politics. You see this again and again and again with different games. Person of color in a pseudo-historical setting? Forced diversity. No more upskirt shots in a horror game? Pandering to the SJWs. Muscular women in the post-apocalypse. Must be trans. For what it's worth, I don't get that last one. She hasn't been confirmed trans nor cis, but don't let that stop you from getting angry. Of course, all those examples are not politics. People who are different from you, or don't wear skirts, are not political. It's not an agenda, and they're not trying to unwrite white men from history or something. Most of us should know this, but this isn't new. Politics have been in games for a very long time. There isn't a sudden push to put it in their terms, shove politics down our throats. What they're really upset about is that it's become much more relevant and not as easy to ignore. Putting aside the fact that having a gay, trans, or non-white character in a story is not politics, there have been countless games with political messages in them. Such is the case with a little RPG called Morrowind.
They have taken you from the Imperial City's prison, first by carriage and now by boat. To the east, to Morrowind. Fear not, for I am watchful. You have been chosen.
The Elder Scrolls III Morrowind, if you didn't know, is an open-world RPG released about 18 years ago in the much simpler time of 2002. I was about 5 when it came out, and that means I couldn't read. A shame, because the game's story is entirely told through dialogue boxes. But that didn't stop me from revisiting it in my teens. The game has continued to be, for over a decade, my favorite game of all time for a variety of reasons. It has interesting and unique lore, a fantastical and hostile landscape, and deep game mechanics. However, Morrowind is not without its flaws, of course. The game would be a hard sell to modern audiences, with its antiquated combat system in particular being a turnoff for many players. See, not every strike with a weapon will hit. Low skill with a weapon and a drain fatigue bar will mean you will often miss swings. Beyond that, the game is often buggy, and riddled with technical issues. Not to mention that 18 years of graphical development leave Morrowind looking very much like a product of its time. I used to think one of the coolest places in Morrowind was this big dragon statue in the center of Ebonheart's port. It, looked better when I was a kid? If you are interested in the game, I hope you can overlook those issues. If you can't, the game is extremely mod-friendly, and still has quite the active community nearly 2 decades after the initial release. Almost anything can be tweaked to your heart's desire, and if you decide to dive into the island of Vattenfell, a whole host of colorful, interesting and unique characters await with their own personalities and motivations. Well, not all of them, of course. Some are just walking info kiosks to make the world seem more alive without actually doing anything. The characters that have been fleshed out tend to be leaders of factions. These factions can range anywhere from a simple missionary group trying to spread their faith in a land that have traditionally worshipped their deities' opposites, to one of the three ruling great houses on Vattenfell, the volcanic island located in the center of Morrowind, on which the game takes place. The Great Houses are interesting factions in particular. They have counselors or notable people within the house that govern districts under their control and are part of a wider council that oversees Morrowind's legislation. Of the five Great Houses of Morrowind, only three of them hold any stake in Vattenfell. House Hlaalu, an association of merchants that have strong ties to the Empire of Cyrodiil, which ostensibly rules Morrowind, House Redoran, an army of warriors that value strength and prowess in battle, and House Telvanni, a loose coalition of powerful magisters that are xenophobic and distrustful of outsiders. Naturally, none of these houses get along very well. Counselors are constantly bickering not only with the counselors of the other houses, but also with counselors of their own house. These squabbles were at one point so bad that the houses would regularly engage in open warfare. Until that practice was outlawed, of course. Now they just use assassins. While being the governing body of Morrowind, the houses are many times not working in the interests of their citizens. For example, one Hlaalu quest has you convince a merchant to sell their hides to House Hlaalu exclusively, while one counselor even coerces you into posing nude for him so you can earn a promotion within the house. Most egregiously, the final quest you complete to become the highest rank in House Hlaalu has you seize control of the illegal assassin outfit, the Kimona Tong, not to destroy it, but to effectively strip power from a councilman and force him to support you as Grand Master. In House Hlaalu, money and political power trump all, even human life. The other houses are not much better, if at all. One Redoran quest has you kill or free a slave in a mine in order to incite a revolt against the slave owners. While you can free the slave instead of murdering her, such an action is not made out of a love to another living being, but because House Redoran considers the mine their property and it is currently being exploited by House Hlaalu. The Telvanni are arguably the worst house when it comes to actually governing their districts. While some of the other houses have you do quests that would be of some benefit to the people under them, such as clearing out some creatures so travelers and villagers will be safer, most, if not all, of the Telvanni counselors give you tasks that are entirely self-serving. These quests can range from retrieving alchemical ingredients to suppressing a slave revolt. No thought is given to the well-being of their citizens. You might be asking, Tailgunner, how is this relevant to any real-world politics? To that I answer, how the hell is it not? The polarization of political parties has only gotten deeper as time goes on, and we're seeing politicians ostensibly fight for Americans while continuing to line their pockets and toe the party line. The political parties continue to bicker and nothing gets done. Fundamentally, it's a broken system, just like the great houses of Morrowind. Morrowind is not the first piece of media to present a criticism of party-based democracy, and it certainly will not be the last. But it's important to know that at the core of this criticism is a political view that has a very obvious message to the player. Of course, in the grand scheme of things, the Great Houses are more or less set-dressing. Their questlines are there to be goals and accomplishments a player can set out to do beyond the scope of the game's main quest. And speaking of the main quest, it has much to say about our politics today. Like all Elder Scrolls games, your character in Morrowind is a prisoner with virtually no backstory. You arrive on a ship to Vattenfell and are freed by the request of the Emperor, Uriel Septim VII. The only catch is that you're supposed to report to a man named Caius Cosades. Through him, you are recruited into the Emperor's spy network known as the Blades, and later learn that the Emperor believes you are the Nerevarine, a prophesized reincarnation of the ancient Dunmer hero, Lord Nerevar, and destined to defeat Dagothar. More on him later. You of course cannot just be the Nerevarine, you must prove you are the Nerevarine. This is where the first hurdle comes into focus. The Dunmer are very xenophobic. From the moment you set foot on the island, the Dark Elf natives constantly refer to you as an outlander.
Wealth beyond measure, Outlander. How can I be of service to you, Outlander?
It's not enough that they know you are not from the island. They want you to know that they know you are not from the island. In essence, they are othering you, or treating you as intrinsically different and alien to oneself. The amount of vitriol expressed towards Outlanders varies from one person or faction to the next. For example, House Lalu and the Imperial Legion are accepting of all races and creeds, but House Telvanni and some of the Ashlanders express much contempt for them. This is particularly troublesome, for as you progress through the game's main quest, you must convince every Ashlander tribe to recognize you as a Nerevarine, and every great house to declare you their Hortator, or war leader. As we already are familiar with the great houses, allow me to explain who the Ashlanders are. The Ashlanders are Dumneri nomadic tribes who follow very traditional lifestyles of ancestor worship. Long before the events of Morrowind, they had lived as equals with the more settled Dunmer on Voddenfell. However, the advent of the great houses forced them into poorer hostile lands. There are 4 Ashlander clans: the herders, hunters, and fishermen of the Ahamusa tribe, the warlike and particularly xenophobic Arabenimson tribe, the mystics and lore keepers of the Urshalaku tribe, and the traders of the Zainab tribe. Now that we know who the Ashlanders are, you might have already began drawing the real-world connections. Native inhabitants of lands such as the Americas and Australia are no stranger to the treatment the Dunmer give towards Morrowind's Ashlander tribes. Forced relocation when the land's new government wants what they own and being looked down upon as backwards and primitive savages are the hallmarks of imperialism's legacy.
The Ashlanders hate the House Dunmer, who have become soft and who have abandoned traditional ancestor worship for the gods of the tribunal. And the Ashlanders hate Outlanders, who invaded and stole their land and forced them to live as subject people. A reborn Nerevar who could drive out the Outlander invaders, destroy the false worship of the tribunal, and restore the pure traditional life and faith of the nomads would be a very popular hero to the Ashlanders.
The open irreverence towards the needs and suffering of the Ashlanders trying to live traditionally is only exacerbated by the construction of new towns to house imperial garrisons and immigrants. It's no wonder why someone in this situation might resort to an outright hatred of Outlanders. Even this is comparable today, where Native Americans often find themselves in a cycle of poverty, with the US government refusing to do much about it. According to the US Census Bureau, in 2012, 2 of the 5 poorest counties in the United States are located in Indian reservations. In that same year, the ACS determined that 26% of all Native Americans live in poverty, and that's not even taking into account atrocities such as the Trail of Tears and the numerous broken promises that have forced the native population to relocate. This is the type of oppression faced by Ashlander tribes. It's why the Ashkan of the Arabenimson tribe refuses, under no uncertain terms, to recognize you, an Outlander, the manifestation of their suffering, as Nerevarine. It's why you, unfortunately, have to kill him. By comparison, the mage lords of House Telvanni are much less sympathetic. Their xenophobia is entrenched in a desire to maintain horrible systems, such as slavery. They are not the oppressed, they are the oppressors. Even joining the house as an Outlander is difficult, as only one counselor, Master Arian, is willing to take in foreigners. Even then, you are only given menial tasks by the other counselors until you are promoted high enough. The current Archmagister of House Telvanni is, unsurprisingly, a representation of the house's ideology. Arrogant, distrustful of Outlanders, and an ardent isolationist, Archmagister Gothrin will never give the player his support to become either Hortator or Archmagister of House Telvanni. However, in House Telvanni, might makes right. And if you were to kill another counselor, clearly you had the better argument. It is only fitting that a man stuck in the rut of traditionalism be killed by those traditions. Beyond the resentment towards Outlanders and the Empire at large, the Telvanni society also has a distinct hatred towards Ashlanders, even among the settled Dark Elves. In fact, it's even the subject of an Ashlander quest. In order to be named Nerevarine by the Zainab tribe, you must first do some tasks for them, like most of the other tribes. However, one of the tasks is to find the Ashkan of Zainab, Kaushad, a bride. In particular, he wants a Telvanni bride. And he also wants her to be thick, but that's neither here nor there. When mentioning this to Telvanni counselors, you get some rather telling remarks.
That is completely stupid. Remarkably stupid. You need to shut up more often.
Telvanni noble wed an Ashlander. If this is the beginning of a joke, I am not amused.
Well, no one can say you are too conventional. No, on careful reflection, I believe that a marriage of a Telvanni noble to an Ashlander Ashkan is impossible for all known definitions of possible. Sorry, I didn't mean to... Well, you must admit, it does sound a rather silly idea, doesn't it?
Even the comparatively open-minded Master Aryan scoffs at the idea of a Telvanni woman and an Ashlander Ashkan being wed. It is in fact impossible for Kaushad to marry a Telvanni bride. To actually complete the quest, you must buy a slave and dress her up to look like a Telvanni noblewoman. In retrospect, it's kinda fucked up. The idea of one ethnic group being wildly adverse to marrying someone of a different ethnic group is not unique to the world of Morrowind. It's only been 65 years since the tragic killing of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old black kid that was lynched for whistling at a white woman, not even entering into a relationship with her, just the mere act of whistling. What's more is that last year in 2019, the University of Mississippi suspended 3 white students for riddling the sign that memorialized Emmett Till with bullets. When you see that the Telvanni are characterized as backwards traditionalists who cling to the most vile of practices, it's not hard to draw these connections to the real world. And that's what makes their characterization all the more meaningful. The writers are trying to tell us something. Tell us a story about intolerance and bigotry, and with any hope, impart on us a lesson about how we can be better to one another. Previously I mentioned that I would go back and talk about Dagoth, and so I will, because his story and his beliefs are what inspired me to do this project in the first place. But before we do that, we need to know why he's Dagoth. In the First Era, the land of Morrowind was known as Risdain and had 2 cultures that lived there, the Dwemer and the Chimer. The Dwemer were agnostic elves that had an aptitude for craftsmanship. Whether it be technological wonders or fine weapons, the Dwemer were more than capable at creating them. In stark contrast, the Chimer, basically ancient dark elves, were Daedra worshippers who were led by a prophet known as Vela, and sailed away from their homeland to escape persecution. Unfortunately, the differing views between the Velothi and the Dwemer proved to be a point of contention, and ultimately led to clashes between the 2 cultures. Already we can see the influence of human history in this story. Like the Chimer, the Jews of our world have been constantly forced to relocate. Whether it be the biblical tale of Moses leading the Jews to the Holy Land, or the more modern expulsion from countries that Jews have faced, it seems history has not been kind to them. And just like the Chimer, it seems their beliefs are never truly accepted anywhere. Back in Morrowind, it seemed like the idea of a truce between the Dwemer and the Chimer would be laughable. However, the Nords later invaded the land and claimed it as part of the First Empire of the Nords. Seeing as the Sons of Skyrim were never able to penetrate the defenses of the Dwemer's subterranean cities, a myrrh rose amongst the Velothi and united the great houses of Morrowind to become Hortator. This was Nerevar Indoril, and with the entirety of his people at his back, he forged an alliance with his personal friend Dumak Dwarf King, who used their collective might to repulse the Nords from Morrowind when they were routed at the First Battle of Red Mountain. In the years following, Morrowind flourished as the 2 nations worked together. Nerevar later married a woman named Almalexia, tutored under Sothasil, and took a junior counselor named Vivek. However, his most loyal servant was the Lord High Counselor of House Dagoth, Vorin Dagoth. It was with their guidance that he ruled. As all things do, the time of prosperity had to come to an end. Through means lost to history, Vorin Dagoth learned of a secret Dwemer project to exploit the tremendous power of an ancient artifact known as the Heart of Lorkhan. Lorkhan was a trickster god who had conned powerful spirits to create the world of Mundus, the plane of reality in which the Elder Scrolls games take place. This upset the status quo, and in turn upset the original spirits. As punishment for his actions, they tore his heart from his chest and flung it onto the planet of Nirn. It is there that the volcano Red Mountain formed, and created the island of Vodensfell. Among the gods in the Chimer's pantheon resided Lorkhan. Any attempt to exploit power from an artifact belonging to Lorkhan, doubly so for the agnostic Dwemer, would have been seen as blasphemous. When Nerevar heeded the words of Dagoth, he went to his friend Dumak and asked him about their plans for the heart. Dumak denied any such project, as High Craft Lord Kagranak had hidden his plans to tamper with the heart from the king. When Nerevar approached him again and demanded they tell him what they planned to do with the heart, the Dwarf King took great offense and relations with the two nations began to wane. Eventually, Nerevar was forced to unite the great houses and once again take up the mantle of Hortator. Unfortunately, not much is known about the events during this war, dubbed the War of the First Council. However, we do know that the final battle was the Second Battle of Red Mountain. During this battle, Nerevar and Dagoth stormed the fortress in the center of Red Mountain, where they confronted both Kagranak and Dumak. Kagranak, who had created the tools to harness the incredible power of the heart, began to tamper with the heart once more. However, all that is known after that is that the Dwemer disappeared. Some say that they may have unwrote themselves from reality, while others think that Kagranak succeeded in ascending his entire race to godhood. Whatever the case is, every Dwemer in the Plain of Mundus ceased to be on that day. What happened to Nerevar is similarly disputed, but it's commonly believed that Amalexia, Sothosil, and Vivek were overcome by their greed and desire to use the heart and poison the wounded war leader. Foreign Dagoth, who had been entrusted with the tools of Kagranak, fought to avenge his fallen comrade. However, he was mortally wounded and only managed to barely cling to life and create a connection with the heart. This connection made him immortal, but incorporeal. Some years after the battle, the Chimer who had betrayed Lord Nerevar formed the Tribunal. With the help of the tools of Kagranak, they used the heart to become divine. This betrayal of the Chimers invoked the wrath of one of their deities, Azura. As such, she cursed the Dunmer with ashen skin and red eyes to symbolize their deceitful actions. The Tribunal's godhood was not a permanent ascension, however. To maintain their connection to the heart, they had to periodically embark on pilgrimages to restore the flow of power. It is during one of these pilgrimages that the Tribunal were accosted by Vorin Dagoth, who had become reborn with the power of the heart, and like the Tribunal, became a living god. It is then that he took up the mantle of Dagoth-Ur. Many years later, the Tribunal would lose the tools of Kagranak while attempting to retake the Dwemer citadels leading to Red Mountain. These citadels had begun to house creatures known as ash vampires, who were created by Dagoth's use of the heart. His sphere of influence grew larger as he spread a terrible disease known as the Blight. The worst form of this affliction would eventually render the carrier a mindless zombie and was known as Corporus, with symptoms including violent insanity and the appearance of tumors that threatened to disable whole parts of the body. Being diagnosed with the disease was a fate worse than death. In order to try and stop the spread of not only the Blight, but Dagoth-Ur as well, the Tribunal ordered the construction of the Ghost Fence. The Ghost Fence was a massive magical wall that contained the infected Corporus. However, flying creatures and ash storms were still a possible vector for the disease, and the Ghost Fence only reduced the amount of infections. If you ignore the Blight, it's been very tempting to sympathize with Dagoth-Ur. Driven mad over the years after seeing his friend die at the hands of the people he trusted and trying to fight against them is not bad. However, Dagoth-Ur isn't interested in helping everyone, because Dagoth-Ur's ideology can be summed up in one word: ultranationalism. Ultranationalism is an extreme form of nationalism. It promotes the interests of one nation, usually an ethnic group, above all others. It's closely linked with fascism, which is generally thought to be the end goal of ultranationalism. Dagoth-Ur wants to instate a theocratic dictatorship over the province of Morrowind. At the head will be him, who will all worship a brass god known as a Kulakan. This brass god will be brought to life by the power of the heart, and with this robotic deity, Dagoth plans to rid the world of anyone who isn't Dunmer. And with that said, it becomes very hard to sympathize with Dagoth-Ur. The game doesn't beat around the bush. Dagoth-Ur is a terrible threat and must be eliminated. In doing so, the writers have imparted on you a deeply political message. The threat of fascism is dangerous and must be stamped out by any means necessary. It might be easy, and depending on what type of person you are, comforting to believe that fascism is not a relevant ideology anymore. The fact of the matter is that this line of thinking could not be farther from the truth. Fascism is seeing a resurgence in many nations, particularly the United States. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, white nationalist hate groups have seen a 55% increase since 2017. Atrocities like the Christchurch shooting and El Paso shooting were inspired by fascist lies that white people are currently undergoing a genocide orchestrated by the other races. In online rhetoric, the term cultural Marxism is a phrase seen being used increasingly to describe a supposed secret communist plot to place socialist messages within media. This is in actuality just the German term cultural Bolshevism, which means the same thing but was coined by the Nazis in the 1920s. Even seemingly benign phrases such as "yes, Jew" are being used by less than benign individuals. This sign was posted on the cars of people who had engaged in protests against the murder of George Floyd at the hands of law enforcement. It's also worth noting that Dagothar's recruitment methods mirror that of actual neo-Nazis. Across Morrowind, the player can run into several NPCs that will proclaim the word of Dagoth. These NPCs are known as sleepers and have been brainwashed by Dagothar's promises through their dreams. These sleepers, should they give themselves fully to Dagothar, mutate into grotesque monsters, losing their sight and mind as they become more and more devoted to their figurehead. In a similar way, Nazis often tap into the fears and emotions of working class or frustrated individuals. By convincing them that someone else, not the failure of the market or the government, but a race of people is responsible for their suffering, they essentially brainwash them into believing that they have no other choice but to join in this defense for their own sake. These are people that could just as easily channel their frustrations into better political activism, but let their fear take hold of them. In the end, like the Ashghouls, they lose their sight and mind to the lies of fascism. In the end, they become the monsters they were afraid of. In the end of Morrowind's main quest, you defeat Dagothar. You put a stop to the Blight and save Tamriel from suffering a genocide. You are praised for your actions and hailed as a hero. Many times, Morrowind's quest will make you question if you truly made the right decision, if the other side had a valid argument. But not this time. The game lets you know that you have unequivocally put an end to a great evil, and that, I think, says a lot.
You no longer bear the burden of prophecy. You have achieved your destiny. You are free. The Doom Duima's folly, Lord Dagoth's temptation, the Tribunal's seduction, the God's heart freed, the prophecy fulfilled. All fate sealed and sins redeemed. If you have pity, mourn the lost, but let the weeping cease. The blight is gone, and the sun's golden honey gilds the land. Hail, Saviour, Hortator, and Nerevarine. Your people look to you for protection. Monster and villains, great and small, still threaten the people of Vardenfell. Enemies and evils abound, yet indomitable will might rid Morrowind of all its ills. For you, our thanks and blessing, our gift and token given. Come, take this thing from the hand of God.
When people say they don't like politics in video games, they oftentimes are not talking about politics. Many times they are referring to the acknowledgement that LGBTQ individuals exist. And sometimes it's about race, and rarely there are times when they actually do talk about politics. However, political messages in video games are not what I would consider a negative aspect when it comes to storytelling. These political themes want to make you think about the topic at hand and draw comparisons to the world around us. It's part of what makes games art and adds depth and gravity to the game's plot. Ignoring these political themes and taking satire at face value is how we get people that believe that Fallout is a game that blames communism for the end of the world, or think that the most important takeaway from The Witcher is that Polish culture is uber all. That's why I think it is not only good, but commendable for a video game developer to tackle political issues in their games, because without that message, we'd be left with a simple story of doing an objective because we were told to. And that, I think, makes for a very bland and shallow narrative. If you made it this far and were already under the impression that politics in video games was explicitly a net loss for everyone involved, I'd like to thank you for at least hearing me out, even if I didn't change your mind. Go ahead and tell me what you did or did not like about this video if you wish. I'd love to see the feedback, honest. If you liked this video, I'd appreciate if you gave it a like, perhaps even share it around, or even subscribe to my channel. I wish to make more content like this in the future, especially if I know that people would like to see it. A good thanks to Undead Taco for giving a voice to Hulia and Master Gothrin, MochaFappuccino for giving life to Master Neloth, and VThinking for lending his voice to the part of Master Arion as well as moral support. I don't have a Patreon, so I have no one left to thank.
I figured I would also include this part because I noticed around the 1 minute mark of that video you sent, he makes some weird ass noises like he's fucking sleeping or some shit. So here you go. There you go. I hope you enjoyed that little moment I had there. I think that's going to bring us closer together as friends, as family, and as really just it's going to link us together as brothers, I hope. That's my intention with this part. You have a good one, bucko.